Everybody, my name is Will Samuel and I'm a research professional at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and today I'll be talking to you about beavers, wildfire, and fish in Alaska, the last frontier. So I want to kick the presentation off with this picture because it really describes well the influence that beavers have on the environment, especially in Alaska. And so beavers are often referred to as ecosystem engineers, meaning that they change just about everything in the environment around them kind of to fit their own needs. And so here we have an example of a beaver in the lower right who's dammed a stream and flooded the valley bottom and all of that riparian vegetation, which has effects on fish and fish habitat, on wildlife and wildlife habitat. Beavers can also influence permafrost and stream hydrology. And in some places, they've been shown to have interactions with wildfires. And so we're going to be diving into a couple of these today. Specifically, we're going to be asking the questions first, how do beavers interact with wildfires? And then asking what most of you will care about, how do beavers affect fish and fish habitat? And so for that, we'll be starting out in interior Alaska, where my master's thesis was conducted, and then we'll kind of wrap up in my current research, which is in the Northwest Arctic. And so to kick this off, a couple of years ago when I was starting my research, I wanted to see just what is the broad picture of the beaver distribution in interior Alaska. No one had ever studied this before, and I wanted to see what does the population look like. And so one of the really cool things about beavers is that you can see the modifications that they make on the landscape from space. So using satellite imagery, you can actually find the beaver ponds like you can see in the middle of the screen. And you can actually use that to survey the beaver distribution. And so that's basically what we did. With the help of some technicians, I used high resolution satellite imagery to survey almost 900 beaver ponds in interior Alaska. And once we had that kind of census data set collected through these 5 large river basins, I wanted to see what was driving that distribution, that relationship with beavers in their landscape. And so I've kind of already hinted at the idea that wildfire is an important predictor of beaver density. And some other studies have found that things like stream hydrology and geomorphology and also the vegetation on the landscape are really good predictors of beaver distribution. And so to kind of just jump straight ahead to the results, here's what that distribution kind of looked like. So here we have black points representing each of the beaver ponds that we located, the blue lines representing rivers and streams in the study area, and those red polygons representing areas that have been burned historically by wildfires, which are a natural disturbance process in interior Alaska. And so just at first glance, you can see that a lot of this high beaver density area occurs in historically burned landscapes, so in and around those wildfires. And so it's pretty compelling when you just look at the figure, but the models also found very similar results. So wildfire was by far the best predictor of beaver density in interior Alaska, explaining about 75% of the variability in these beaver pond distribution. And so that was really exciting and compelling because that was a big component of my research, and to find that it was so significant was really exciting. And so as we continued that modeling process, we found that not just wildfire, but a combination of wildfire, geomorphology, and hydrology attributes predict beaver density with a really high success rate. Almost 90% of the variability is explained by these attributes. So things like burn severity, valley width, stream gradient, stream power, those kind of things predict beaver distribution really well. And so that was really exciting and compelling as the first chapter of my thesis. And of course, as a fish biologist and fish person, I wanted to connect this back to fish and fish habitat. And so for that, we wanted to start again with a scale that matched those beaver surveys, so a really high level 30,000 foot view. And so for that, we designed a simulation to estimate and compare the differences between the potential fish habitat in the study area versus what is actually available in light of this beaver distribution. So basically, we came up with a pretty simple distribution model to estimate what habitat Arctic grayling could inhabit. And so you can see that here in dark blue. And then we wanted to compare that to these different scenarios where beavers were on the landscape and they were experiencing different flow conditions, which affects a fish probability of passage of migrating over that beaver dam. And so here we have an example of a high flow scenario in green. And you can see that there's a beaver distribution throughout this tributary, and that most of that fish habitat is still available to fish, but the beavers in those really high density areas do start to block off fish habitat. During what we considered kind of a normal flow scenario, about 50% probability of passage, you can see that a pretty significant chunk of that fish habitat is eaten up by the beavers. And then during a low flow scenario, this situation looks pretty abysmal for the Arctic grayling. Almost the entire tributary is cut off by beavers. And this is actually something we found in a number of tributaries in our study area, that these beaver dams clustering at the bottom of a tributary really block off most of the habitat within it. And so this is just an example of a single tributary, but what we wanted to do is expand this across all of the tributaries in our study area, roughly 180. And this is kind of the relationship that we expected to see. So again, comparing the potential fish habitat, that's in a beaver-free scenario. And what we expected to see is that the beaver density, that the fish habitat availability would decline as the beaver density increased, and that relationship would get steeper and steeper as the flow levels decreased, reducing the probability of passage. And so again, to jump straight into the results there, we found that on this tributary scale, on this individual stream scale, that the beavers can definitely reduce habitat availability really significantly. So some tributaries saw up to 65%, 2/3 of their habitat being restricted by beavers, made unavailable. But when you take a step back and look at an entire river basin, it's not quite as extreme. And so these large river basins with high beaver densities are still vulnerable to habitat fragmentation, but it's not like the entire river basin is totally eaten up. So what we found is that in these high beaver density areas during low flow scenarios, anywhere between 14 to 20% of the habitat was made unavailable by beavers. And remember that these are the areas that have a lot of wildfire history, and that's why we think the beaver density is so high in those areas. And then finally, if we take one more step back and look at kind of a landscape level effects of beavers, we see this is even less extreme. So during like a low flow scenario, about 10 to 12% of this habitat is made unavailable by beavers. And so as long as you have kind of this mosaic, this patchwork of beaver, wildfire, and fish habitat suitability across the landscape, I don't think beavers are necessarily an existential threat to Arctic grayling, but they definitely can restrict fish at a local or smaller scale. And so for the second chapter of my thesis, I wanted to follow this up with some field work. And so for that, we used a combination of traditional fish sampling and environmental DNA to try to capture this fish distribution and see if our kind of predictions from our geospatial modeling actually carried out on the landscape. I don't have time to go into all the details today, but to really briefly summarize this, about half of our sites for fish sampling showed little to no fish passage. And so these were all small streams that had really large impermeable dams and no hydrological linkages. And so these are dams that pretty much completely block the stream, reduce flow really significantly. Some of them have trees growing out of the dams, and so they're relatively permanent structures. And these were the ones that really blocked fish passage pretty significantly throughout the summer. On the other hand, the other half of our sites had pretty decent fish passage. In all cases, they were restricted, but these had acceptable fish passage rates. And these tended to be larger streams, which had enough stream power to kind of break that dam out throughout the year during high flow events and provide those hydrological linkages, at least at times throughout the year, to allow for fish passage. Briefly talking about our eDNA results, the relationship here was very noisy, mostly because of issues with the eDNA. But we did find that in general, the trend for eDNA concentration as a proxy of fish abundance follows a very similar pattern to what we predicted in our model. So here we have a declining eDNA concentration as beaver dam density increases, and that's very similar to what we predicted in our simulation. And other studies have found this with different fish species in different areas, have found similar relationships. So I do think that this is fairly representative of what's actually occurring out there on the landscape. And I'm going to be working to further bring more empirical data to this. And so to really briefly summarize all of that work from my master's thesis, we found that wildfires stimulate beaver activity in interior Alaska, and that beavers definitely have the potential to restrict fish habitat availability, especially in high density areas and in low flow scenarios. And that fish distributions in interior Alaska are controlled by a combination of beavers, wildfires, and habitat suitability. And so with all of that in mind, my research now is kind of moving towards the Arctic, which is kind of a new issue. Over the past 50 years or so, beavers have been expanding into this new Arctic tundra environment where they have not been historically. And so you can see some examples from my collaborator, Dr. Ken Tape, showing this stream over 40 years that was completely taken over by beavers and vastly changed the habitat. And then you can see some of his modeling efforts to show where the beaver activity is the greatest in this Arctic ecosystem. And what I think is especially interesting about this area is that not only are beavers expanding into this new environment and potentially affecting fish that aren't acquainted to beavers in these areas, but at the same time, Pacific salmon, have been moving into the Arctic over the past 50 years at greater and greater rates. And so there's not only the concern that beavers are moving in and potentially affecting fish and fish habitat, but there also could be interacting with this other species that's moving in greater and greater numbers. And so with all of that in mind, we do have a rather large team of people to kind of work on and address all the individual pieces of this issue. We call ourselves the Arctic Beaver Observation Network. And so this group is an international group from Alaska, the lower 48, Canada, and even Europe, of scientists, managers, tribal leaders, social scientists, outreach folks, all sorts of different backgrounds to kind of address this issue from every angle. And so we met in February of this year in Fairbanks, Alaska, to kind of discuss the state of the current research, everything that we had done so far, and what the next steps were. And so what we kind of concluded in terms of the priority of research moving forward, everybody pretty much agreed that concerns about beaver effects on the native fisheries is the top priority. And nobody's really worked on this issue yet. There's a lot of concerns about beavers blocking fish and changing fish habitat. And so this will kind of be my role in the project moving forward, is trying to address this issue of beavers affecting native fish. There's also a number of other topics that people are focusing on, things like giardia, mercury methylation, travel across the landscape, permafrost thaw and Arctic greening, but I'm mostly going to be focusing on the beaver and fish component. And so with that, we kind of have the very beginning of our research starting up right now. We received a seed grant to kind of start this whole process. And in my mind, the first step, again, is just to see what is happening and where is it happening. And so for that, I'm going to be doing some mapping, comparing the known beaver distribution collected from my collaborator Ken Tape, and comparing that to the anadromous fish habitat, the documented areas where we have anadromous fish in the Arctic, which are a really important subsistence resource. So I'm going to be doing this mapping study basically to show which of these drainages has the highest impact from beavers on anadromous fish, and which fish specifically, which fish species like dolly varden or whitefish or salmon might be at most risk of this new beaver regime in the Arctic. And so this is going to be a really great opportunity to start again at a high level and then later focus in on more specific research. And it'll also be a great opportunity to discuss community partnerships and what is important to the local communities who are really being impacted by this work. And so that's going to be a big focus moving forward, and I'm excited to get started with that. I've also been working on this little side project. I started it in my thesis, and we're just now wrapping it up. But this is kind of investigating the ideas that beavers drive riparian resilience to wildfires. So this idea was pioneered by Dr. Emily Fairfax in the lower 48 as part of her PhD. And basically what she found is in these dryland or desert type ecosystems that the beavers, by damming streams and flooding the valley bottom, keep that riparian vegetation wet, and that makes it more resilient to wildfire. So here's a pretty stark example of wildfire that burned an undammed stream, and a wildfire that burned the dam stream, and obviously that held up a lot better. The results are really compelling in these kind of desert dryland ecosystems. And so I wanted to investigate that up here in interior Alaska. And to make a long story short, we found that we're not seeing the same relationships. And so there's really been no difference between the beaver ponds and the vegetation around them versus just the regular stream riparian areas and our control sites. And so that's really interesting, even though it's not necessarily a significant result. It's really interesting that we have such a different regime up here, and I think that's mostly due to the fact that our riparian areas are already relatively resistant to wildfires. The valley bottoms don't burn as severely or as often as the hill slopes and the rest of the landscape in Alaska, which I think is different than in these lower 48 dryland type ecosystems. And so this study isn't totally done yet, but I think it's really going to be really interesting moving forward to kind of define how these relationships are different in at a regional scale in Alaska versus the lower 48. And then finally, I'm continuing to expand research for beaver and fish in interior Alaska, in the Yukon River drainage, and in these different areas. So kind of exploring ideas there still, and here's some cool pictures of some beaver dams and ponds. But I'm open to collaborate. If you have any ideas or thoughts or questions, or just want to tell me a story about a beaver, let me know. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone who's contributed to this research, both in funding capacity and technical expertise. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.